Okay, what we're going to do is I'll do a little introduction to our delegation in 2001. We're going to show a little video, and then Jenny Kuida and Sandy Maeshiro are going to tell a few stories about our trip, which was quite a while ago, so we're trying to remember some of those things. But as you notice, we went in August of 2001, a very different world pre-September 11th, 2001. And, you know, just to explain maybe the time, it was Nikkei for Civil Rights had been involved in the redress campaign since 1980, and the Civil Liberties Act passed in 1988. And then it ended 10 years later in 1998. So we'd been very busy with that kind of work, trying to find people, make sure that they got eligible and people received their redress until the act ended in 1998. So finally we thought, great, we have a little breather here. We can kind of do things that would be, you know, interesting and connect with other people and other places, because we've always had a relationship with other groups and tried to build ties. And so it, you know, 1999, next year, my sister, Judy Nishimoto Ota, went to Cuba because her first husband was Cuban, and her daughter was half Cuban and half Japanese. And they were going to Cuba for a visit there, and she insisted on tagging along. So we want to mention these people because we owe thanks to a lot of people for our connection to Cuba that came before us. And unfortunately, all of these people are not with us anymore. So Judy Nishimoto Ota went to Cuba in 1999, and she was actually fighting cancer at the time, but she struggled and went there, and she happened to, she's a very outgoing person, so she met a couple of people at the airport. She saw a couple of Japanese women. I think one of them's last name was Harada, and she happened to work at the Japanese consulate. So she asked this lady about Japanese in Cuba, and she introduced her to Francisco Miyasaka. And we owe thanks also to another person, Shinya Ono, who also passed away last year, because he's the one that told us there are Japanese in Cuba. And he knew this because of some of the people in Japan who had export-import business and had traveled to Cuba. So he had told her about that. So, and you know, and one other person we owe thanks to is a man named John Henson, who was with the Cuba Solidarity Group, and he really assisted us a lot in making our connection possible in our trip. A lot of questions. It's very difficult to go to Cuba, so it's as people will talk about. So this was our thanks to those three people, at least, that I wanted to mention, and all three of them are not with us, as I said. So when Judy went to Cuba in 1999, she met with Francisco Miyasaka, who by chance did work with, had connections to the Japanese consulate, was trying to form a society, a Japanese society in Cuba. There already really was one on the island of Youth, but he was trying to form one in Havana. And he was, at that point, realizing that the Japanese in Cuba were losing their identity, and they didn't really know, the young people didn't know that culture and that history. So he was trying to connect people and bring them together. He shared stories with her about Japanese in Cuba, and she came back very excited and thought it was a great idea if we could bring Francisco to the United States. And he made an ideal person because he spoke Japanese, because he had worked in the Japanese consulate or the Cuban consulate in Japan. So he spoke Japanese, he spoke Spanish, and he spoke English. So he was trilingual. So the following year, NCRR, and sponsored by many other organizations, UCLA, Cal State, the museum here, a couple of organizations in Northern California, Pro Arts, and the Community Center in San Francisco, all sponsored a trip for Mr. Francisco Miyasaka. And he traveled and he came and spoke to really huge crowds. The Janum Central Hall was filled. I think there was over 200 people there. And he talked about the 1,300 people that were in Cuba, and he had actually had a directory of every single person in Cuba who was Japanese, where they were from, what province they were from, and their address. And we have that copy actually on our table, but since it's from year 2000, it's probably dated. And at that time, I think he mentioned, or when we went, there were about 10 Issei still alive. And I'm sure that many of them are not alive now. And his mother had been alive at that time too, but she passed away. So Mr. Miyasaka came, and his mission was to try to raise funds so that there could be a video and a TV monitor in every province where Japanese were, so they can share videos, and at that time videos, of Japanese movies, Japanese culture, anything, so that people could learn and connect and hear more about who they were and their background. And so that was a start, you know, with Mr. Miyasaka, and the trip was a really great trip. I think people learned for the first time about Japanese in Cuba. And we say Cuban Japanese because I think their identity really is as Cubans first. And the fact that the revolution, and Mr. Miyasaka was involved in the revolution, and he talked about how after that they were able to go to school. And they were able to get education and go to college. And without that, he would not have gone to college. So they were in a very difficult economic situation as Japanese in Cuba before that. So he suggested the idea of why not continue this exchange and have Japanese delegation come to Cuba the following year. So we thought it was a great idea, and we organized ourselves to go the following year in 2001. And just to say briefly, the outline is that our plan was to bring medicine, Japanese foods, and some culture. Now, 18 people doesn't mean that we're all really, we called ourselves cultural workers, because in order to get a permit, they only gave it to people that were, you know, cultural people or had some training. So we had Nobuko Miyamoto actually in our midst, and she really is a cultural worker, if you know. She's from Great Leap, and so we all sort of claimed that we were part of that group, even though many of the people had never danced or born, you know. So we learned at Senshin, they trained, we had practices, and Tankobushi and 1+1, the two easiest dances. And we made everybody practice and learn. And so we took that to the Island of Youth for their Obon in that year. We also met Japanese Cubans in Havana, had a dinner and a gathering there, but we did bring Japanese foods, and mutual trading gave us a great deal in providing some of the food. And the community raised a lot of money. We had a fundraiser here before we went. So we owe thanks to the community for raising funds for that. And we visited the prison on the Island of Youth, and I think the other delegations did as well, where Japanese had been held during World War II, the Japanese men, the adult men, I believe. So I think that we're going to see the video of the Island of Youth, where you see us talking with the Harada family at their farm, and also the Presidio Modelo, it's called, where the Japanese were held along with some Germans and Italians. And it happens coincidentally, but the same prison where Fidel had been held. And I think maybe the last thing I'm going to say is that we had hoped that our exchanges would have continued, that we would have continued, like, you know, go 1 year, bring somebody back the next year. But as you know, 2001, September 11th, changed everything. So the following year, we had tried to bring 2 Nikkei women from Cuba to the United States, and we're not successful. So that's kind of where we're at. But we'd like to show the video of the Island of Youth piece.